They say the Mendocino fog erases old wounds. But what happens when the only thing left holding you together is the silent gaze of a dog who's lost as much as you? When a quiet girl risks everything for one last chance to bring her father's German shepherd home, a town must decide what matters more: rules, or the hush of kindness in the face of grief. Would you have the courage to fight for the only soul who's never given up on you? Stay with us to the very end. Even the hardest hearts will discover why this story could change the way you see loyalty, hope, and what it means to come home. What would you do for someone who waited through every storm, just for you? Let us know in the comments, and don't miss the lesson that waits at the end. The Mendocino Fairgrounds. In early summer carried a kind of hush that belonged more to memory than to mourning. Before the crowds came and the lights blinked to life, the old fairgrounds were claimed by the fog. Mist drifted in from the Pacific, ghosting across the parking lot, softening the bright edges of the festival banners and folding every sound into a muffled cradle. Above, rows of ancient cypress and bishop pine stood like silent sentinels, their branches thick with dew, and the air held a chill, faintly salted, that lingered even after the sun began to peer through the haze. Beneath the silver canvas tents, the town's elders moved slowly, unfolding tables and dusting off wooden benches that still smelled faintly of last year's bonfire smoke. A radio crackled somewhere near the entrance, a weathered voice speaking of another cold front coming in from Point Arena. Here and there, the clatter of metal, the distant call of a seagull, the gentle shuffle of boots over gravel. Even the sheep in their makeshift pens seemed subdued, as if aware that this day, this particular day, demanded reverence. It was here, at the far edge of the fairgrounds, where the shadows lasted the longest, that Nora Hayes appeared. She moved as if uncertain of her place, each step careful, measured. A young girl in a man's oversized coat, its sleeves rolled up so many times the lining had begun to fray. The coat once belonged to her father, the man the town still spoke of in hushed tones, sometimes with pride, sometimes with sorrow. It hung from her narrow shoulders like a story she couldn't quite set down. In her left hand, she clutched a small wooden box, polished smooth with age and worry, its latch loose from years of gentle opening and closing. Inside were the fragments of her father's life, a faded badge, a pair of silver cufflinks, the last photograph they'd taken together, his arm around her, both squinting into the late autumn sun, cheeks pink from wind and laughter. Nora kept the box close, tucked beneath her arm, as if it could anchor her against the slow, relentless drift of time. No one greeted her as she passed beneath the striped archway. A few glanced up, offered nods or small, tight smiles, but none approached. Perhaps it was the hour, or perhaps it was the quiet gravity that seemed to settle over her like fog. The bakery stand was just opening, and the smell of warm bread and cinnamon mingled with the sharper tang of sea air, drifting past without quite touching her. Past the row of crafts and produce tables, tucked in a shaded corner of the livestock barn, was a chain-link pen set apart from the others by a simple cardboard sign: Charity Auction, Retired 9. Baron, 7 years of service. There a German shepherd sat, old but not frail, his coat peppered with silver at the muzzle, his eyes dark and deep as the night surf. He lay quietly, one paw crossed over the other, head raised, ears pricked forward, with a dignity that softened only when he caught sight of Nora. For a moment, nothing in the world seemed to move but the slow rise and fall of Baron's chest. Nora hesitated a few paces away, her shadow stretching across the sawdust, merging with his. She did not approach. Instead, she stood in the half-light, listening to the quiet hum of preparations, watching as an elderly man wheeled a cart of gardenias past, as two teenagers strung paper lanterns above the stage where the main event would unfold later that day. Each detail seemed heightened. The sharpness of her breath in the morning cold, the faint clink of the box's latch against her knuckles, the way Baron's tail stirred once, then settled again, heavy as a sigh. Time pooled around them. Nora at the threshold, Baron watching from within. She remembered the way her father used to walk these grounds, hand resting absently on Baron's broad back, always stopping to greet the neighbors, to ask after old friends, to lift her onto his shoulders so she could see the fireworks above the trees. Now the trees stood unchanged, but everything else felt altered, rearranged by absence. A breeze pushed through the barn, carrying with it the scents of baking, hay, and the ocean beyond. Someone laughed softly at a distant stall. A bell rang as the coffee stand opened for business. None of it touched Nora. She gripped the box tighter, willing her feet to move forward, but stayed rooted where she was. Baron did not bark or whine. He simply watched, his gaze steady, unblinking, the way only those who have known both loyalty and loss can watch. The fairgrounds seemed to pause around them, the world narrowing to a narrow corridor between girl and dog, memory and present. The air trembled faintly with things unsaid. The longing in Nora's downturned eyes, the quiet question in Baron's. For a moment, even the rising sun seemed reluctant to disturb the hush. Soon, the fair would fill with voices and footfalls, the cheerful noise of summer crowding out all but the bravest silences. But in this brief space before the world awakened fully, there was room for Nora's grief and Baron's waiting. Two figures at the edge of mourning, each carrying more than they could say, tethered by the hush of old love and the hope that, somewhere beneath all the noise, their hearts might still find one another. Beneath the low roof of the livestock barn, the light fell in broken lines, slanting through dust motes and the webbed spaces between weathered boards. Outside, the fairgrounds were waking, the distant clang of a hammer, the soft rising din of voices, the slow blossoming of color and movement that marked Mendocino's annual festival. Inside, everything remained suspended in half-shadow, a liminal world, edged with the scent of hay and the faint musk of old wood. Nora stood just beyond the fence, arms folded around the wooden box pressed to her ribs, as if the act alone could keep her from dissolving. She tried to focus on the little details, the shape of her boots in the sawdust, the way the hem of her father's coat brushed the back of her knees, the sound of Baron's breathing, so steady it almost masked her own. Each of these things felt like an anchor, keeping her moored to the barn floor while everything else, her future, her family, the sound of her own voice, seemed to drift further out of reach. From her place in the dimness, she watched Baron lying curled in his pen, eyes fixed not on the crowds gathering outside, nor on the volunteers moving between stalls, but on the empty bench near the far wall. It was an ordinary bench, battered smooth by years of use, but Nora knew it as well as the lines on her palm. She remembered how her father, Walt Hayes, would sit there on festival afternoons, one leg crossed over the other, the brim of his cap low over his eyes, always with a hand resting on Baron's thick ruff. She remembered, too, the sound of their laughter in the old kitchen, her father tossing Baron the heel of a crusty loaf, Baron catching it mid-air, tail thumping hard enough to rattle the cupboards. She remembered coming home late after soccer practice, the house dark except for the yellow porch light, and seeing her father's cruiser parked out front, Baron waiting at the window, nose pressed to the glass. The click of the door, the chorus of welcome, one voice deep and steady, one joyful and wild. But those memories lived now like flashes of color against a pale background, always fleeting, always unfinished. In the weeks since the funeral, Nora had avoided both the bench and the barn. It wasn't just the ache of seeing Baron alone. The fur at his muzzle turned whiter since that winter, or the way the old dog's eyes seemed to carry questions she couldn't answer. It was the certainty that if she let herself get too close, if she looked too long, she might fall into the space left by her father and not find her way back. Baron, for his part, lay in a posture of old patience, one ear half cocked, his gaze drifting between the bench and the barn's wide doorway. Even when a pair of younger children wandered up to the pen, sticky fingers pressed to the wire, whispering in excitement about the police dog, Baron did not move. He watched with the composure of one who had seen too many comings and goings, who understood that most things in life pass by without ever truly touching you. At one point, a woman in a bright apron leaned over the gate and called out, "He's a handsome fellow, isn't he?" Nora glanced up but didn't reply. The woman offered a quick smile, then returned to her trays of muffins, her words hanging in the air like the last note of a song. No one else lingered. The day was growing brighter, and people were drawn to the light, to the games and food and distant call of the parade. But for Nora and Baron, the world remained turned inward, a quiet orbit of memory and distance. From time to time, Nora's mind drifted, unbidden, to the days just before her father's accident. She remembered the change in his face when the radio crackled late at night, the way he would pause at the threshold, as if listening for a storm only he could hear. She remembered the last morning, how her father had knelt to tie her shoelace, his hands rough but gentle, and how Baron had leaned in, nosing her cheek, as if memorizing the shape of her laughter. Now all that was left were small relics, an old photograph, a badge cold to the touch, the memory of a hand on her shoulder, a look that said, "You're safe," even when the world seemed to say otherwise. Baron shifted in his pen, laying his head down between his paws, exhaling a sigh that stirred the sawdust. His eyes closed for a moment, lashes flickering as if in a dream. Nora watched, remembering the times he would curl beneath her father's desk, keeping watch through long hours when the rest of the world slept. She wondered what he dreamed about now, whether it was the old days of chasing waves on the beach, the steady rhythm of patrol along the bluff, or simply a house with all its people gathered safe inside. Around them, the barn began to fill with the slow tide of festival-goers. Somewhere a bell rang 3 times. A flock of children in red vests darted past, laughing, scattering the sunlight. Still, Nora lingered in the shade, her fingers running absently along the grain of the wooden box. She caught her reflection in a streaked window, pale, serious, eyes too old for her face. For the first time that morning, Baron lifted his head fully, searching the crowd until his gaze found hers. They regarded each other across the narrow distance, one heart aching with questions, the other waiting in the stillness, unwavering. No words passed between them. There was no need. In that silent exchange, a small current of warmth threaded through the cold. Nora's shoulders eased. Baron's tail thudded once, soft as breath. The world beyond the barn moved on, bigger, louder, indifferent. But here, in the shelter of half-shadow and memory, there was a fragile space where loss could be borne without shame, and love, even quiet and wounded, might begin, slowly, to call itself home again. By mid-morning, the fairgrounds had shed their hush. The stalls grew crowded, laughter lapped at the barn doors, and a trail of muddy footprints mapped out the day's excitement. But at the far end, past the bustle of jam tastings and blue ribbon pies, the livestock barn kept its own solemn rhythm. The familiar click and hum of the old loudspeaker crackled to life, a man's voice echoing from the beams. "Attention, please. The charity auction for our retired K9 Baron will begin at 11. All are welcome." People wandered in by twos and threes, curiosity etched on their faces. Some carried coffee, some with notepads or phones, a few with small children in tow, eager to point at the shepherd who had once, it was said, chased off a bear from the schoolyard. A teenage girl in a FFA jacket lingered near the edge, twisting her braid. An older man, his county cap creased with sweat and memory, sat heavily on a bench, as if he'd come just to see how things would turn out. Nora drifted in with the crowd, though she kept to the periphery. She moved without hurry, as if wading through a tide of half-remembered voices. In her hands, the envelope felt lighter than it should. The sum inside gathered from odd jobs, raking leaves for Mrs. Gutierrez, sweeping the back room of the library, a birthday bill her aunt had sent last spring. It was not enough for a show, and Nora knew it, but she brought it anyway, folded carefully, her name written in blue ink in the corner. Not as a ticket to win, but as a gesture, a last stitch in a bond she couldn't name out loud. Baron's pen had been pushed closer to the auction platform, beside a sign painted in careful, wavering hand. Charity Auction, Retired K9 Baron, 7 years of service. Below that, someone had tacked an old newspaper clipping. There was a photograph. Baron at Officer Walt Hayes's side, the two of them standing under the shadow of the lighthouse, squinting into the bright wind, a look of quiet pride shared between them. A hush fell as the auctioneer, a silver-haired man in suspenders, stepped up to the microphone. His words had a gentle weight, as if he too felt the responsibility of the moment. "Friends, neighbors, thank you for coming. Today we gather not only to help find a new home for Baron here, but to honor his service and the memory of a good man." He nodded toward the pen, and Baron looked up, ears flicking, gaze settling once again on Nora. "He's getting on in years, but he's got heart left. If you're bidding, I ask you, do it with love. He deserves nothing less." A few awkward laughs, a scattering of applause. The bidding began. A local store owner called out the first number, more out of tradition than true intent. A middle-aged woman upped the ante with a quick, practiced wave. Another man, the type who liked to be seen, rattled off a higher sum. The crowd, though small, pressed closer. The bids rose by slow increments, each number echoing off the barn's old rafters. Nora's hand closed over the envelope. She did not call out, not at first. Her throat felt tight, her voice somewhere far away. She watched as Baron's eyes tracked the shifting crowd, the restless stirrings of feet, the occasional pointed glance in her direction. A girl near Nora whispered to her father, "Is that the police dog who found Mrs. Barlow's cat?" The father shushed her, never looking away from his phone. The bids crept higher. Baron stood now, his tail hanging low, weight shifting from paw to paw. He did not bark nor whine, he only watched, his gaze unwavering as it traveled from the faces in the crowd to the one face that would not meet his. Nora felt the moment coming, the pulse of it slow and inevitable. She unfolded the envelope, lifted her hand, voice trembling. "I'd like to bid," she said, barely louder than the hush itself. The auctioneer leaned forward, a kindness in his eyes. She held out the envelope, the sum inside small against the rising numbers. The room was still. "It's all I have," she whispered. For a heartbeat, the barn seemed to contract around her, all eyes drawn not to the envelope, but to the way her hands shook, the way she held herself upright in the shadow of so much absence. The auctioneer accepted the bid, voice gentle, almost apologetic. Thank you, Nora. We'll count it as the spirit of the day. The next number rang out, almost immediately, eclipsing her offering, but Nora did not move. She stood, silent, at the margin of the gathering, feeling the weight of 1,000 small kindnesses and 1,000 losses settling quietly between her and the world. As the numbers rose, she watched Baron lower himself back to the straw, head resting on his paws, eyes on her. The sound of the auction blurred, muffled by distance and grief and the knowledge that some things, loyalty, memory, love, could not be won or lost in public, not truly. In the end, the barn filled with the ordinary bustle of a summer day. Bids called, hands raised, laughter echoing from the open doors. But for Nora and Baron, the space between them remained unchanged. A quiet corridor where only the heart could travel, where hope and hurt lived side by side, waiting for a moment when one might reach across the silence and be answered. The auction rolled forward on the steady, predictable rhythm of numbers, a cadence as old as small-town life itself. Each bid landed with a certain weight, a sharp sound followed by a murmur, a shifting of bodies on benches, a tilt of a hat, a cough into a hand. The barn, which had seemed so full of possibility in the early light, was now thick with the ordinary tension of wanting, of loss, of the strange calculations people make when something precious is up for grabs. Nora remained near the back, where the sawdust grew thin and the air was touched with the damp of the sea. The envelope was gone now, accepted by the auctioneer and set gently aside, a gesture she understood as both kindness and finality. Her hands found the wooden box again, her thumbs tracing the small brass corners. She told herself to be still, to be grateful just to have been here at all. But the world inside her chest fluttered with the ache of something unfinished. Baron stood through most of the auction, his body rigid, ears pricked at every call of his name. With each new bid, he turned his head, sometimes toward the crowd, sometimes back to Nora, as if he could not decide which hope to follow. When her eyes met his, she saw not pleading, but a kind of dignified confusion. It was the look of a creature used to duty, to belonging, suddenly stripped of orders and left to interpret the hush for himself. A man with a bright jacket, someone Nora did not recognize, bid high, his voice loud, drawing laughter from his friends. A woman in pearls countered, her tone softer but just as determined. The auctioneer nodded each time, eyes flicking between faces, careful to keep things moving. The numbers began to leap, 50, 100, then several hundred more. Nora felt herself growing smaller with every round, as if the very air was pressing her back, making her less visible, less necessary. There was a moment, quick and sharp, when she nearly raised her hand again, though her money was spent, though her chances were gone. She caught herself, let her fingers curl instead around the cuff of her father's coat. The urge to speak, to step forward, trembled in her throat, but she bit it back. What would she say? What could she offer that the others could not? Her thoughts turned inward, looping back on themselves. She saw the memory of her father, broad-shouldered, laughter in his eyes, the way he would kneel and whisper something into Baron's ear before every shift, something private, a secret the two of them shared. She remembered the sound of Baron's claws on the linoleum kitchen floor, the way he'd curl under her feet during thunderstorms, the warmth of his fur when everything else felt cold. She wondered, for the first time, if Baron missed her as much as she missed him, or if the space between them had grown too wide to be crossed by longing alone. As the bidding slowed, the barn seemed to hold its breath. Baron's head drooped, his tail lay flat on the straw. The crowd, sensing the end, leaned in, some whispering, some calculating. The auctioneer paused, scanning the room, his gaze softening as it passed over Nora, perhaps recognizing, perhaps remembering. Then the gavel rose, the bids came to a halt, and it was done. Baron was won by Mr. Malley, a man known around town more for the size of his property than for gentleness. Malley's voice was brisk when he spoke, and he did not look at Baron as the auctioneer announced his name. There was no applause, no celebration. The barn resumed its ordinary volume, voices swelling to fill the vacuum. Nora stayed where she was, her back to the wall, while the crowd began to scatter, drifting toward lemonade stands, toward the lure of sunlight. She let the moment wash over her, disappointment so pure it was almost relief. At least now the waiting was over. She caught a final glimpse of Baron as the handlers approached his pen, unfastening the latch with careful, practiced hands. Baron stood, stiff-legged, uncertain, and for a heartbeat, just one, he turned, his gaze seeking her through the shifting legs and shadows. Nora did not move. She wanted to, but she stayed. It was not bravery, but something quieter. The knowledge that goodbyes, when they must happen, are sometimes best honored by silence. With the pen unlatched, Baron was led away. The sound of his claws against the concrete, softer now, nearly lost in the growing noise of the afternoon. He did not resist, but once, just once, he paused at the exit, looking back through the dust-moated air to the spot where Nora still stood, motionless as driftwood. Outside, the sun had climbed high, burning off what was left of the fog. Nora left the barn without speaking to anyone. The crowd parted easily for her. A few adults nodded, but most were drawn by the call of the midway, by the promise of sweeter things. The air beyond the barn was heavy with warmth, the smell of popcorn and grass and the distant, bright tang of the sea. Nora's feet carried her down the slope toward the edge of the fairgrounds, her steps automatic, each one echoing the hollow beat of her heart. The wooden box grew heavier with each block, her father's coat too warm now in the sun. But she did not take it off. She did not look back. Inside the barn, Baron watched her retreat until she disappeared, his body still, his eyes dark with an old, unspoken question. Then the doors swung shut, and only the hush remained, pressed into the straw like a prayer half-remembered, waiting for the night. The fair unraveled behind Nora as she walked, the distant carnival calls softening to a haze of color and sound. She wandered past the booths of sunflowers and fudge, past the families gathering for group photos by the painted cutouts of cows and fishermen. She moved unseen, a figure in an old coat, her steps slow, her eyes lowered, a shadow crossing through the brightness of midday. At the edge of the grounds, a patch of grass, trampled and brown from hundreds of feet, offered a quieter place. She paused here, standing between the fair and the ocean, feeling the shift of air from warm to salt cool. The Mendocino headlands rose in the distance, dark and wind-beaten. Somewhere seagulls called, circling above the cliffs. Nora felt the pull of the sea and let herself follow, putting more and more distance between herself and the voices of the fair. Baron was gone. She had not seen where Malley took him, but she pictured the old truck parked out back, the battered kennel door swinging open, the rough words spoken to an animal who could never answer. In her mind's eye, she saw Baron huddled in a strange yard, the grass damp, the sky wide, his world reduced to a patch of earth, and the memory of gentle hands now absent. There would be new rules, a new leash, no familiar footsteps in the hallway, no voice whispering to him at dusk. Nora's chest tightened. She wished she could banish the image, but it lingered, stubborn as the mist clinging to the bluff. The fair behind her faded to a dull hum. Nora pressed forward, feet sliding on the narrow path that traced the edge of the salt marsh. This was the place she came as a child, when the world was too loud. The place her father brought her after long days. The place where Baron would bound ahead, tail waving, then circle back, tongue lolling, always eager to be sure they followed. Now the path felt changed, lonelier. The sky, once wide with promise, seemed to press lower, the air heavy with something left unsaid. She found a spot among the tall grasses, where the ground was spongy beneath her boots, and the ocean wind made the wildflowers bend. There she sat and opened the wooden box. Her fingers moved over the mementos. Her father's badge, still cool, the brass worn to dull gold at the edges, a dog whistle silent for years, a yellowed photograph of 3 shadows on the beach. Herself, her father, Baron. Last, folded neatly, was her father's old handkerchief, checkered blue and white, edges nibbled, a small hole where a young Baron had once tugged it from a jacket pocket and worried it through a long, anxious night. Nora lifted the cloth to her face. The scent of home lingered, faint now, salt, sun, a trace of cedar. She pressed it close, her breath trembling, and let her eyes close. The world shrank to the warmth of memory, the slow, steady sound of her own breathing, the ache that came not as a sharp pain, but as a tide rolling in, slow and inevitable. She stayed that way for a long time, letting the ocean and wind fill the empty places. Around her, the grasses swayed and whispered. The earth shifted, and far below, the waves battered the rocks in their endless rhythm. Nora felt the pull of grief, not as something violent, but as something quiet, persistent, a thread running through the center of her being, tying her to every absence, every unfinished sentence, every echo of laughter lost to time. By the time she opened her eyes, the sun was slipping west, turning the sea to a band of hammered silver. The fair's music had faded to a single thread, barely audible. A flock of starlings twisted overhead, dipping and rising as one. Nora stood, the box cradled in her hands. She looked back at the fairgrounds, at the emptying stalls, the trail of balloons drifting above the rooftops, the distant echo of someone calling a name she could not quite make out. She felt in that moment emptied out. Not destroyed, but hollowed, as if her sorrow had carved a new space inside her. She wondered, idly, if that was what healing looked like. Not the return of what was lost, but the making of room for something softer to settle in. As she made her way home, the streets of Mendocino were already painted with the gold of late afternoon. Porch lights flickered to life, the scent of supper drifting from open windows. Nora moved through the quiet as she always had, unnoticed, solitary, a part of the town's fabric but also apart from it. At the end of her block, Mrs. Gutierrez nodded to her, holding out a bag of fresh bread without a word. Nora accepted it, surprised by the weight in her palm, and murmured a thank you she wasn't sure anyone heard. Inside her own house, the air was still, holding the shape of what had once been, boots by the door, a leash looped on a hook, a shallow dent in the carpet where Baron had always waited for his partner to come home. Nora knelt beside the spot, laying the handkerchief and badge on the floor. She sat quietly, listening for the thump of a tail, the quiet yawn of a dog stretching after sleep. There was only silence, a silence that seemed to fill every corner, gentle and heavy, a silence that belonged not only to loss, but to the hope that somewhere, something of what was loved, might yet find its way back. Night gathered at the windows. Nora did not turn on the lights. She sat in the hush, one hand resting on the wood of the box, the other curled around a scrap of cloth that still held the shape of love. The world outside was vast, indifferent, streaked now with the first lights of evening. But here inside these small rooms, a girl and her sorrow kept company with memory and waited, if not for rescue, then for a sign that absence could become, in time, a form of quiet grace. The evening descended in layers, first the sky paling above the rooftops, then a chill threading through the alleys, and finally a hush settling over Mendocino, broken only by the distant murmur of surf against the cliffs. Nora, unable to remain inside, drifted toward the coastline. She passed familiar houses with yellow light glowing behind curtains, neighbors preparing for supper, the low rumble of a TV or the click of dishes behind an open window. She passed unseen, a wisp of movement in her father's coat, the wooden box now left on her dresser as if setting it down could lighten her burden. At the edge of the village, the land spilled toward the sea in long, rough meadows. Salt grass pressed flat by the wind and flecked with wild fennel and ice plant. Here the earth was soaked with old weather, every step springy, the mud cold through the soles of Nora's boots. She moved toward the place where the cliffs softened into a shelf of grass and pale stones, a spot she and her father and Baron had claimed as their own on so many afternoons. The path, overgrown but remembered by her feet, led her between low shrubs and broken posts left from forgotten fences. As she reached the bluff, the wind pressed her hair back from her face and stung her cheeks with its sharp, clean scent. Below, the Pacific rolled and surged, all slate and foam. The horizon was blurred by dusk, a thick gray seam where sea and sky stitched themselves together. Nora folded herself down into the grass, knees hugged to her chest. It was not a place for tears. She found none, only the hollow fullness that grief brings, crowding out all but the simple need to be still. She let her eyes rest on the endless motion of water, the way the waves battered themselves to nothing against the rocks, again and again, without anger or hope. Time passed in a way she could not measure, her mind emptied of plans or even language. The world here was pared down, the damp chill creeping through her coat, the give of earth beneath her, the steady wind humming through the wild grass. She drew the handkerchief from her pocket and spread it on her lap. The little holes along the edge, Baron's doing all those years ago, made her smile, soft and unbidden. For a moment, she was 5 again, watching her father clean his glasses, Baron nosing her knees, all the warmth of home alive and close. She pressed her palm flat against the cloth, wishing that some fragment of her father's calm or Baron's silent confidence might seep into her skin. Far above, a hawk circled, riding the last updrafts of daylight. Nora tracked its movement, let her mind drift with it, soaring and dipping until the ache in her body eased to something quieter. The ache remained, but it was changed, a dullness, no longer a sharp cry for what was lost, but a readiness to notice what remained. The bite of wind, the silver line of the sea, the sweet clover tangled at her feet. As dusk thickened, the wind shifted, blowing in with a taste of coming rain. In the west, a bank of clouds gathered, purple and low, shot through with fading gold. Nora let the darkness fold around her, trusting the shape of the land, the rough comfort of grass, the sound of her own breath mingling with the sigh of the ocean. A gull called once, then was silent. She did not hear the text come through on her phone at first, lost in her coat pocket. It was only when she moved to stand, her joints stiff from the cold, that she saw the glow, a message from Mrs. Gutierrez checking in, her words brief and gentle. "If you need supper, there's extra on the porch." And Nora, someone called from the fairgrounds, looking for you, said it was about Baron. "Are you all right?" Nora's heart lurched, a sudden hopeful pain that made her weak. She fumbled to reply, "I'm okay. I just needed the air. I'm coming home soon." She didn't ask about Baron, didn't trust herself to form the words, but the question rooted in her chest, stubborn and alive. Was he safe? Was he eating? Did he think she had abandoned him? Or did he remember the hush of evenings at her father's feet, the way she once stroked his ears to soothe him to sleep? The night came on fast. Wind chased a scatter of rain across the bluffs, spattering Nora's coat and cooling her hands. She pulled herself up, legs trembling, and turned back toward the dim lights of the village. As she walked, the weight of loneliness pressed in, but there was also something else, faint but real. A thread of purpose, a promise not to turn away from love, not to let it vanish simply because the world no longer made sense. When she reached her house, supper was waiting in a covered bowl on the porch, warm and fragrant. She carried it inside, grateful for the steadiness of such small gestures. She ate at the kitchen table, barely tasting the food, the silence broken only by the tick of the clock and the sigh of wind at the window. She let her eyes drift closed, imagining Baron's warmth pressed against her shins, the gentle weight of his head in her lap. That night, sleep came slowly. Nora lay curled under a thin blanket, the window cracked to let in the scent of rain. In her dreams, she heard the click of claws on old wood, the quiet rumble of a dog's breath at her ear. She woke before dawn, heart pounding, and knew with sudden certainty that her story with Baron was not yet finished. Somewhere, beyond the hush and the ache, the old thread that had tied them all together still held. And as the rain fell and the world drifted toward morning, Nora listened, not for words, but for the hush that comes before a miracle. The rain continued through the night, tapping a steady rhythm on the old house's tin roof, running in rivulets down the porch steps. Mendocino was still, the storm keeping even the stray cats huddled beneath eaves. Nora lay awake, the handkerchief balled in her fist, her father's coat draped like a shield over her small frame. She listened to the night, ears straining for sounds she could name, but the only familiar noise was her own breath, steady but thin. It was just past 2 in the morning when the phone vibrated against her nightstand, its low hum foreign and urgent. For a moment she didn't move, afraid that answering would break something fragile inside her. But the name blinking on the cracked screen, Mally, drew her upright, heart stuttering. The message was short, abrupt, a kind of surrender. "Baron won't eat. Hasn't moved since the auction. If you want to see him, better come tonight. He's waiting for you." Nora's shoes were by the door before she realized she'd stood up. She shrugged into the coat, its weight a familiar comfort, and stuffed her feet into her father's old boots. The world outside was black and wet, the rain slanting sideways in the wind. She moved quickly, head bent, feet splashing through puddles on the empty road. Mally's property lay on the edge of town, a long walk in the best of weather, But the storm made each step heavy, each breath cold and raw. The streets were deserted. Porch lights blurred behind curtains of rain. The taste of salt and eucalyptus carried on the air. She thought of Baron as she walked, of how he would sometimes lope ahead and then double back, always sure she was coming. At the gate, Mally's truck sat hunched under a gnarled pine, headlights off. The house behind it was dark. A barn lamp burned, flickering over the fenced run. Nora let herself through the latch, boots sinking in the soft earth. The grass was beaten flat, puddles shining in the dim glow. Mally met her at the barn door, eyes wary, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He didn't scold or explain, just gestured with his chin. "He's in the back stall. I tried everything. He's waiting for you." Nora nodded, unable to answer. She moved past him, the smells of hay and wet fur pulling her back to 100 childhood mornings. The barn was warmer than the world outside, shadows moving across the walls in the sway of the single light bulb. She found Baron curled in a corner on a pile of clean straw, unmoving but not asleep. She knelt beside him, slow, careful not to startle. Baron's ears flicked, his head turned, eyes finding hers in the half-dark. For a breath, neither moved. Then Nora reached into her pocket and drew out the old handkerchief, folding it into a small square, her hands trembling. She set it in the straw before him, the familiar scent lifting between them. Baron's nose twitched. He leaned forward, sniffed, then pressed his muzzle down onto the cloth, closing his eyes as if, for an instant, he was a pup again, sheltered and certain. Rain beat harder on the roof. Nora lowered herself further, curling one arm over Baron's broad neck, the other hand resting just above his heart. He was thinner than she remembered, the bones of his shoulder sharp beneath her palm, but the warmth was the same. She whispered nothing, no comfort, no plea, just breathed beside him, letting her heartbeat find its old pace in the quiet of his company. They stayed like that a long time, the hush broken only by the storm and Baron's uneven breaths. From the doorway, Mally watched, rubbing his jaw, his own face shadowed by something close to regret. Finally, he stepped inside, clearing his throat. "I'll leave you two alone. Take all the time you need." The barn was theirs again. Nora stroked Baron's fur, feeling the wet and warmth mingling beneath her hand. She remembered nights as a child, listening to her father hum lullabies off-key while Baron dozed beneath her bed. She remembered how, after her mother left, her father never spoke of sorrow, just gave her space to feel it, trusted that she and Baron would carry each other through. Now Nora offered the same gift. She said nothing about the pain, nothing about the empty house or the long months of silence. She simply remained, presence in place of promise, letting Baron lean into her, letting the thread of memory draw them closer than words ever could. Eventually, Baron shifted, a small whine building in his chest. Not quite a cry, more a question. Nora pressed her forehead to his, closing her eyes. The air was thick with hay and storm, the kind of darkness that invites secrets to surface. She didn't notice Mally return, didn't hear him place a blanket over her shoulders, didn't feel the weight of the world recede, only that for the first time in a very long while, she wasn't waiting alone. They stayed like that until the rain faded and the cold light of morning began to seep into the cracks of the old barn. When Nora stood, stretching sore legs, Baron followed, slow but willing, his eyes brighter, his tail giving a single hopeful thump against the straw. The invisible thread had held. Dawn unfolded quietly over Mally's property. The storm washed away, but leaving the world drenched and clean. Pale light crept through the barn's open window, turning the puddles in the pasture to pools of silver. The air, scrubbed of all yesterday's heat and voices, felt like something new, something honest. Nora woke where she dozed, curled beside Baron, the handkerchief still beneath his chin and a scratchy wool blanket draped across her shoulders. Her back ached, her knees were damp, but a gentle steadiness had replaced the ache that had throbbed through her chest for so many nights. Baron stirred as the sun reached his face. He blinked, slow and bleary, then lifted his head to nudge Nora's wrist. His eyes held the faintest flicker of anticipation, a question and a greeting. Nora smiled softly, her fingers threading through his fur, rubbing circles into the place behind his ear she knew so well. The sound that rose from him, a low, contented rumble, was as close to thank you as any dog could offer. Mally appeared at the barn door, a mug of coffee in each hand. He stood for a long while before entering, as if measuring his words or weighing the cost of regret. His voice was rough but kind when he finally spoke. "You stayed all night." He handed Nora one of the mugs, the steam warming her cold fingers. "Didn't figure you'd leave him, not after all that." Nora shook her head. "He was my father's partner. He's more than just a dog." Mally looked at Baron, then at Nora, then down into his coffee. "That's clear enough," he said. "I thought a dog like this would bring me a little pride, maybe make the neighbors talk, but he never took to me. Won't eat, won't settle." He sighed, the lines around his mouth deepening. "Last night I watched the two of you through the window. I saw the way he waited for you, and the way you waited for him." His voice gentled, breaking through his usual gruffness. "Sometimes you can't buy your way into a heart, no matter what you offer. Sometimes the right thing is just giving up what you wanted." The silence in the barn stretched. Baron thumped his tail, the only sound between them. Mally took a breath, as if shedding a burden. "Take him home, Nora. I'll sign whatever needs signing. Just promise me you'll keep him close, that you'll be there for him, as much as he's there for you." Nora's eyes stung. She reached out and gripped Mally's hand, a gesture spare but sincere. "I promise." It was done with so few words. No grand gestures, no declarations. Just a nod, a handshake, the press of a form into Nora's palm a half-hour later, signed with Mally's heavy scrawl. Baron rose with her, slow but steady, moving as if his bones had remembered their old strength. Outside, the rain-washed world shimmered with small possibilities. The scent of grass was sharper, the distant hush of the ocean closer than ever. Nora walked home with Baron at her side, every few steps glancing down, half afraid he'd disappear. But he kept pace, his limp more pronounced after so many days of worry, yet his head held higher than she'd seen since her father's death. They moved quietly through the town's back streets, Baron pausing sometimes to sniff at doorways or greet an early-rising neighbor with a polite wag. At the corner of Main and Cypress, Mrs. Gutierrez saw them and stopped, her bag of groceries forgotten. She didn't rush over, didn't exclaim. She simply nodded, eyes shining, and reached out a hand for Baron to sniff. He obliged, tail brushing against Nora's shin. No words were needed, just the gentle warmth of understanding, passed from neighbor to neighbor. The house felt changed when they returned. Nora opened the door and let Baron inside, watching as he moved from room to room, pausing in the places he'd once kept watch, by the door, under the table, at the foot of her bed. She followed him, touching the places where his absence had weighed the heaviest. He circled back to her at last, sitting at her feet, pressing his nose to her palm. That afternoon, the neighborhood gathered itself in quiet ways. A plate of cookies left on the porch by someone Nora had never really met. A fresh bouquet of wildflowers set on the steps. Children walking by on the way to the park, waving, their voices low but excited. "That's the police dog! He's home again!" Barron watched them all, ears perked, content to simply be near, the hubbub of small-town life weaving itself back around him. Nora, for the first time in what felt like seasons, let herself cry. Not the sharp, bitter tears of loss, but the slow, grateful ones that follow an unexpected kindness. Barron sat with her through it, not moving, just present, as he had been for every sorrow and every quiet joy. Evening came, and the house glowed with the old light again. Nora set her father's coat on its hook by the door. She placed the wooden box on her nightstand, the handkerchief neatly folded beside it. In the kitchen, she set out 2 bowls, one for herself, one for Barron, and watched as he ate, slow but steady, his tail brushing the cabinet in a rhythm older than memory. That night, as the sun dipped behind the cypress and the ocean sang its endless song beyond the town, Nora sat on the porch steps, Barron at her feet. They listened to the world settling, to the sound of their own hearts steadying in the hush. Across the fence, Mrs. Gutierrez raised her cup in a silent toast. Nora lifted her hand, the gesture small but whole. Barron, content, lay his head in Nora's lap, and the weight of loneliness softened beneath the hush of new belonging. There are seasons in a small coastal town that seem to pass with little fanfare, each day folding into the next, time measured not by calendars, but by the slow unfolding of ritual and habit. In the weeks after Barron's return, Mendocino slid quietly into late summer, the mornings touched with mist and the evenings thick with the scent of wild fennel. The wounds of winter and loss did not vanish, but they grew less sharp, their ache softened by the rhythm of small, ordinary things. Nora and Barron settled into patterns familiar and new. Some mornings, while the air still shimmered with dew, they walked the winding path behind the house, Barron's pace slow but sure as he picked his way beneath the cypress. He stopped often, nose lifted to the wind, sometimes turning to wait for Nora when she lingered to watch a covey of quail burst from the brush, or to trace her fingers along the lichen that furred the old fence posts. These walks were quiet. No music, no conversation, only the steady crunch of their steps and the hush of the ocean rising and falling somewhere just out of sight. In the afternoons, they'd return to the porch, where Nora sat with a book and Barron sprawled at her feet, eyes half closed, ears always tuned to her slightest movement. The sunlight warmed the porch boards, casting their shadows long and gold across the threshold. Sometimes a neighbor would pass, offering a wave or a gentle word. "He looks strong today," or "Glad to see you out, Nora." There was no need for more. The town's sorrow had been witnessed, shared in the hush of kitchens and the brief, meaningful silences of passing strangers. Now kindnesses returned in small ways, a loaf of bread left by the door, a handwritten note tucked under the mat, the slow but certain ease with which people resumed their gentle interruptions. Barron aged quickly that first month back. The limp in his back leg became more pronounced after the long days of stress, and his muzzle, always grizzled, turned a pure, cloud-soft white. But he seemed lighter, too. The burden of uncertainty lifted. He found his favorite places in the house, beneath the living room window, curled on Nora's old quilt, beside the garden where the thyme ran wild. In the evenings, he'd nudge his nose under Nora's palm, his eyes dark and warm, and she'd rest her hand atop his head, letting the silence between them say all the things she couldn't yet find words for. Sometimes the two of them walked the longer route, looping down toward the bluffs, the salt wind playing with Nora's hair and Baron's ears flapping in the gusts. The land here was open and wild, a tapestry of tangled grass and low, scrubby sage. Here Nora found herself breathing more deeply. The sadness that had settled in her chest loosened a little each day, washed out by the wind and the steady, living presence of her companion. Neighbors noticed the change, not only in Baron, but in Nora as well. Where she had once turned inward, her eyes wary, she began to answer greetings with a nod, sometimes even a half smile. Mrs. Gutierrez, who baked too much and always had a story to share, began leaving small gifts on the stoop again, a basket of blackberries, a note folded into a recipe card, a sprig of rosemary for luck. Once, Nora found a loaf of still-warm sourdough and a scrap of paper with only 3 words, "You're not alone." She tucked it into the wooden box on her nightstand, alongside her father's badge and the old handkerchief. The healing came not in a flood, but in increments, quiet and almost invisible. Nora and Baron, each scarred by absence in their own way, found solace in the repetition of gentle acts. On afternoons when the sun lingered, Nora brought out her father's battered chessboard and set the pieces for a game she never quite finished, Baron's tail sweeping lazy arcs against the floor. On cool evenings, she wrapped herself in her father's coat, curled up by the open window with Baron pressed close, both of them listening to the crickets and the distant hush of the surf. It was not only Nora and Baron who changed. The town seemed to draw closer around them, the old ties of neighborliness re-knitting themselves. Children, once awed by the story of the police dog, grew bold enough to call out, "Hi, Baron," as they passed, sometimes pausing to offer a shy petting or a treat. Grown men at the hardware store nodded with approval. Even Mally, who now crossed the street with a gentle wave, seemed lighter, relieved of some old, unseen weight. With every small return to living, Nora found herself piecing together not just the fragments of her own heart, but a sense of belonging she had feared was lost forever. In the soft hours before dawn, with Baron's breath rising and falling beside her bed, she learned to hope again, not in grand, shining miracles, but in the slow, sure accumulation of gentle days. And so, in the cool hush of late summer, with the first leaves of fall trembling on the cypress branches, Nora and Baron settled into their healing, a family, re-knit by the daily acts of kindness, the trust of shared silence, and the steadfast promise that, in this small corner of the world, they were home. Autumn eased itself into Mendocino quietly, not with drama, but with small changes. The evenings drew in a little sooner, the mornings touched with a faint silver chill. The cypress and bishop pine dropped needles over the porch, and the wild fennel by the roadside turned from green to ochre. On certain afternoons, a slow wind tumbled yellow leaves across the yard, gathering them in eddies at the foot of the steps. Nora watched these changes as if they marked time not only for the earth, but for her and Baron as well. The local harvest festival was announced in the market window on a sheet of yellowed paper, thumbtacked among old flyers for piano lessons and lost cats. Nora paused before it on her walk home, Baron close at her side. She read the list of events: apple pie judging, a bluegrass band, a contest for the best carved pumpkin. At the bottom, in a shaky hand, someone had written, "This year, we give thanks for those who came home." It was Mrs. Gutierrez who convinced Nora to come, slipping an invitation into a bag of scones. "Bring that old partner of yours," she wrote. and let the town see how hope can look. Nora folded the note and put it in her pocket. That evening, she sat on the porch with Baron, the letter in her hand, watching dusk settle over the yard. The decision made itself, quiet, inevitable, as so much had been that year. The festival bloomed on a bright Saturday, the field strung with lanterns, tables heaped with persimmons, cider steaming in paper cups. Baron's fur caught the sun in soft silver streaks as Nora led him through the gate. People turned, some waved, some nodded with quiet pride, some children looked up wide-eyed. No one rushed or crowded. The welcome came as small gestures, a pat on Baron's flank, a gentle word, a smile held a little longer than before. In the center of the green, near the long table of pies, a boy Nora had never met approached, slow and tentative, a faded ball cap pulled low over his hair. He stopped a step away from Baron, hand hovering uncertain. Nora knelt, her voice gentle. He likes it if you go slow. He's old now, but he remembers everyone who's kind. The boy crouched, brushing a tentative hand over Baron's neck. For a moment, there was only that hush, the softness of fur, the small wonder of trust, granted and received. The boy's mother watched from a distance, wiping her hands on her apron, her face both tired and grateful. Nora looked up, her eyes meeting the mother's, and in that wordless glance both understood what was being given and what was being healed. It was not about stories of heroism, nor the sharp ache of what had been lost, but about the ordinary ways people could show up for each other. A gesture, a listening presence, the silent assurance that kindness needed no explanation. As the sun drifted toward the horizon, the festival music softened. Nora led Baron to a patch of grass at the edge of the crowd, where the world grew quiet again, and the sounds of laughter and music became a gentle hum. She sat cross-legged beside her old friend, feeling the earth cool beneath her, the weight of Baron's head on her knee. She traced the lines of his ears, the white hairs at his jaw, the soft rise and fall of his breathing. A little later, a group of neighbors gathered, sharing mugs of cider and memories of the year gone by. Someone thanked Nora for bringing Baron, for reminding the town that even after sorrow, goodness could return. Quietly, sometimes slowly, but surely, if one had the patience to notice. Nora only smiled, her voice still soft with shyness, but her eyes clear. When evening finally fell and lanterns glimmered in the blue dark, Nora rose, brushing leaves from her jeans. She led Baron away from the glow and into the hush of the salt grass, out toward the headlands where the sea sighed endlessly against the bluffs. The horizon shimmered gold and lavender, and the world felt both immense and very close. There Nora sat beside Baron, watching the sun set in silence. She told him nothing and everything, letting her hand rest on his back, her heart steady. Baron's eyes, bright and wise, gazed toward the shifting ocean. In that quiet, the ache of all they had lost faded for a while, replaced by a gentler weight. Gratitude for the journey, the comfort of having come this far together, the certainty that kindness, given, received, and passed along, was enough. As the sky deepened to violet and the first star pricked above the cypress, Nora felt not the sting of what had been taken, but the soft warmth of what remained, the steadiness of Baron's breathing, the memory of her father's coat, the quiet courage of neighbors, the echo of small kindnesses blooming where none had been expected. The world would go on, loss would return, and so would joy. But for this one evening, Nora was not alone. She was at home, her hand on the back of a friend who had walked beside her through silence and storm, the hush between them now a gentle thing, a place for hope to grow. And if someone passing by the headlands paused and looked out over the grass, they might see the girl and the old German shepherd, still as stones against the gold of autumn, a part of the landscape itself. They would not know the shape of all that had healed or all that was yet to mend. But they might, if they listened, hear in the hush a promise. So long as we choose kindness, no one ever truly waits alone. When autumn quieted Mendocino and the long shadows stretched across the grass, Nora and Baron showed us something rare. That healing can begin not in grand gestures, but in the silent presence of those who stay. Perhaps it takes the loyalty of an old dog to remind us. Sometimes the greatest courage is to reach out, to keep loving, even when it's easier to close off. What would the world look like if we all chose just once to answer pain with kindness, to listen for the hush that follows loss, and to let someone in? I wonder, do you carry a story of loyalty or a moment when simple kindness changed you? Share it in the comments if you wish, or simply let the quiet between these words become your own. Thank you for staying with us until the end. May you leave with a gentler hope, and remember, no one who chooses love walks alone.